Hey guys, grower friend Jess is back.
Hello.
And we just cleaned this entire field. It's like 90% clean. What do you think, Jess?
Looks beautiful.
Yeah.
She's ready.
And we were done in 2 hours. We are finally in November, and typically November in New Jersey means that the leaves are falling. It's a lot cooler, and this year, even though the leaves are falling right now, I would say it's been abnormally warm. We've been in the 70s, even hitting 80s this week, and there has been no rain. Despite all of that, you still have to put the field to rest. So as you saw earlier in the video, we've been doing a lot of leaf cleanup. Those leaves are going to come in here, and then a weekend ago, grower friend Jess came over and helped me start ripping out the stuff that needed to be ripped out. I would say that in the span of about 2 hours, we got about 80% of what we needed to rip out get ripped out. And I wanted to share a bit about what Jess and I did because I had some questions and I was able to draw from her years of experience of growing. I mean, she has like over a decade of experience of growing. So it was really great to have someone who was not only efficient, but could answer some outstanding questions that I had. So I want to spend some time in this video talking about that, what we're doing to put the field to rest, because we're definitely not done with that yet. I'll share a little bit of high level plans for next year. To be honest, I'm still figuring out what that looks like. And a lot of that is because we are still figuring out my daughter's treatment. So I will say that over the past month, you've probably seen I haven't put out many videos, and it is because we have been focusing a lot on my daughter's treatment as well as her nutrition. So I'll go into details about that, but I will say that a lot of that work has been culminating in probably the most important surgery of her life so far, which will take place on Election Day in the US next week, where we will attempt to remove her tumor, and hopefully with R0, or basically negative margin. So again, more on that later. But I want to spend some time talking about what we did with grower Jess here. And to lay out the context, what's also been interesting this year is that we haven't yet had a true killing frost. So by killing frost, I mean like a substantially very cold night that wipes everything out. Instead, we've had these like 1-2 punches of maybe a night at 34, a night at 36. And because it's a microclimate in different parts of the field, you can definitely see certain parts of the field suffer more than others. In fact, I would say that when you go closer to the house over there, where I started putting in some perennials and even some annuals in landscaping, some of that stuff has completely escaped frost-free. And I'm gonna show you a comparison. So one of the most important things that I think is crucial for you to understand about your growing conditions is where these microclimates are located. And after about 3 years here, I would say I have a decent understanding of what place gets hit by frost here in the field and what places on our property get hit by frost first. And that stuff is pretty useful, especially if you want to extend later into the season in terms of what you're growing, and also making sure that you're not putting stuff out too early. And that's how I learned in this field specifically what area gets a little bit cooler at night, because I lost a lot of annuals earlier this spring when I planted them out a little bit too early, but observed that some areas killed those heat-loving annuals and other places didn't. This is what the entire area looks like. Again, this is a 40 by 90 foot space. What was kind of funny was when Jess came in, she said, wow, this space is actually smaller than what I thought it was going to be. You have a lot of output, but it's definitely a smaller area. So let's talk a bit about what we did. You can see that a lot of the ground is bare, and one of the most pressing things that we want to do is make sure that we cover this soil with at minimum leaves. So you can see that I started doing that over here, and Eric has been doing leaf pickup sporadically whenever we have time. And so you can see that there's a pile of leaves out there. So what we're going to do is we are going to put leaves on here, and this is a very thin layer of leaves right now. I mean, we're talking about like an inch. I ideally want like 4 inches of leaves at the minimum. And then I'm going to go over with a push mower to make sure that it gets crushed and it's small enough so that it can decompose. Now, before I put on leaves, there are certain areas where I want to mend. So this is a really good example. This area over here was intercropped with vegetables as well as flowers. And when I say vegetables, it wasn't leafy greens, it was fruit producing vegetables like tomatoes, eggplants, peppers. So anything that is fruit producing takes up a lot of nutrients in the soil. So I want to give back to the soil nutrients, and to do that, I'm going to bury food waste. So we employ something called the b.a.r.e method, which is our way of composting food. And the reason why we do b.a.r.e is because when we put our composted stuff out there in the field, I can show you where that is, the deer typically get to it. And so we just don't have an enclosed area where we can put food waste out there without animals getting to it. So instead, we do this bucket method. It basically gets fermented, and then we dig a trench and we put the food underneath, and it has worked really, really well. So we're going to do that, and then we're going to lay leaves on top. And what that means is that this area will be ready for spring planting and early spring planting. Like, we would be able to start planting in there even as early as March, which is pretty early here in Zone 7A in New Jersey, assuming that I cover it a little bit, but the leaves will also provide a good amount of insulation for the soil. Providing insulation for the soil is really important because if you think about it, the soil is living. It's a living ecosystem of organisms. So the more you are able to keep that soil warm and from freezing, the better off you are at making sure that there is still life that is living. So for example, earthworms will dig further down into the ground in order to survive the winter. But if you have a good amount of natural insulation on top, that could even be snow, you'll have earthworms coming closer to the surface than if you didn't have the insulation. And so more life around the surface just means a healthier soil when you are able to plant. Now, at the height of winter, obviously things are going to freeze where we are. The earthworm's going to go down, but this insulation is also meant to help warm up the soil a little bit more quickly in the early spring when you do want to plant, or if you already have things into the ground. So this is why I prioritize something like covering the ground with leaves. Ideally, if I was on top of things, I would have put a cover crop first, terminated it, and then put leaves. But you do what you can do, right? So for those of you who can cover crop, that's great. I just want to say that if you can't cover crop, doing something like me where you are bearing food waste and then putting leaves on is also pretty sufficient. All right, so let's talk details about what Jess and I did. Now, this entire area was full of ageratum. There were some tomatoes, as you could see from the cages. And what we did was we went through, and for the most part, we pulled the whole plant out. But you can see that there are still some stems here. We basically took out most of the plant and left the root system in there. And so I can go either way on this. You can still see that there's a sunflower plant over here, which I do plan on keeping here until next spring. I'll bring it out. But I do think that there is some merit in keeping root systems in the ground. Going back to the principles of soil life and soil health, it is most beneficial for you to leave root systems in the ground when you are going to be transplanting other plants into the ground next to that area that used to have roots. And the reason is because if you leave the old plant's roots in the ground, there's still microorganisms that are congregated around the base of the plant root ball. And that is where supposedly the most amount of microorganisms and soil life is. So if you keep that there and you transplant a new seedling next to it, that new seedling supposedly benefits from all of that life in the prior root ball area of that plant that is dying, and they kind of migrate over. That's what I've read. I don't know if it's actually true, but that's what I've read. So for that reason, typically I try to keep the roots in the ground. Now, we are clearly getting ready for winter. Nothing is going to be growing here. So therefore, I don't think that keeping those roots in there is going to be as beneficial as if you were transplanting, but there is still merit in leaving those roots in the ground because they will decompose over time. That will also add organic matter into the soil. So it is one way of letting the soil, do its job and rework matter that you would have put out and get it back into the ground. Now, that organic matter is obviously not going to be enough to sustain the soil. You would still need to put something like compost on or even fertilizer if you were really, really working the soil. But again, we are trying to employ things that, one, reduce our time, because if I don't have to pull up the entire plant and I just snip around the base, That's time reduction, and it's also less stuff I have to put out into the compost field, which, you know, I have to take a wheelbarrow back and forth. And it's also one way of naturally letting the soil retain a little bit more organic matter. Let's now talk about one of my favorite perennials that I relied on from both just bouquet making and even wholesale, and that is yarrow. So you can see over here that this is my little yarrow row. I have more yarrow down there, but I want to focus on this row because this is where I had a question for Jess. Now, before, this area was full of what looked like dead yarrow. I mean, the leaves were pretty brown. We had these dried up stalks, and I said to Jess, I asked her, I was like, do you think this yarrow is dead? Do we need to dig it up? And she looked closely and she said, no, I see some green growth. And what I think we should do is we should just take out all of this dried stuff and basically give the green leaves a little bit more sunlight. And I will tell you, in just a week, I actually have seen some growth on these little leaves that were appearing. So what we did was we cleaned out this entire area, basically gave it a little bit more air and space. And now you can see that these are going to be ready to overwinter for next year. Now you've got this patch over here, which is a little bit more established. There's a lot more green here. And so we're going to leave it as is. Now, this is going to be in its third year. And so if you know anything about yarrow and people's experiences with keeping yarrow, you'll know that it tends to lose its color over time. Meaning if you have like a berry or a pink type of yarrow, it might actually revert to white. Last year, what I did was I actually divided the yarrow, and that seemed to have helped it in year 2 because I retained the color. What we did this year was we pruned back pretty significantly, so I didn't divide it. Basically, we just we took the full plant, and now it's probably about 2/3 of the size that it originally was. These yarrow over here were actually the results of the transplanted yarrow from over there. And so these will be going into year 2. And to be honest, I haven't done that much other than pulling out dead stems like this to make sure that the seeds aren't going back down into the ground and reseeding. So we're going to see what happens next year. But I will say that if you have perennials that are looking a little tired or dead and you see some growth underneath it, make sure you give them a little bit of space, air, sunlight by taking out all of the dead stuff. And that is just something that we should be routinely doing anyway. One thing that still needs to be done is with these snapdragons, I need to be cutting them to the base. I want to try overwintering them for next year without cover. I'm going to be chopping them down to the base and then putting leaves on top. And when I visited my friend Crane down in Tinton Falls, which is about an hour and change away from here, he was able to successfully overwinter I think they were Potomac snapdragons. So I want to try to do the same for next year and see if it works. If it doesn't, it's totally fine. You can see over here, I have some dahlias that are, I mean, they're done, obviously. They have been completely taken out by the frost. I am keeping all of my dahlias in the ground this year. And I know that that may not be the smartest thing to do from both, will they make it? And also from the fact that dahlias that are overwintered tend to be a little bit more pest prone. But this kind of goes into what I'm going to be talking about later, which is plans for next year. I'm willing to take that risk. And the other thing is I realistically just don't have the time to dig, put everything away and do that kind of work. So we're going to try to keep everything as low maintenance as possible. Now, this is one row that is going to look like this for winter. And the reason is because I had interplanted mums. So here are some mums that are starting to bloom. And I just want to make sure that they are protected by the elements. Now, mums should actually overwinter here in New Jersey. And I know this because I actually bought clearance landscaping mums that were literally on their way to death. Put them in late November last year. It was like close to December, and they look great. So here's a photo of what that looks like right now. And they took basically all spring and summer to bulk up, and then now they look great. So I want to see if I can basically overwinter these mums too. So these are heirloom mums. Now, I don't know what the difference between heirloom mums and landscape mums are for deer, because the deer have figured out a way to get in here. I have a buck that's been using its antlers and trying to basically create a hole in the fence netting. And so these were beautiful heirloom mums that I plan on cutting and giving to CSA customers as a free bouquet. And look, the deer ate all of them. The deer not only ate all of these, they also ate like a ton of my lilies. So that's also a reason why the season has been cut short unexpectedly, which honestly is totally fine because it allows me to focus on my daughter. But anyway, so as I was saying before, this ageratum is clearly done. It is going to stay here. I'm going to remove it in the spring. And I think it will actually probably self-seed. So I'm probably going to have quite a bit of ageratum next year. And that's totally fine. I've learned that you don't need a lot of ageratum. This is one tray of about 200 ageratum. All of them didn't fit in this row, by the way. So I had to disperse them out throughout the entire field. The rest of them are mostly pulled out. But in the future, I would plant at most half a tray. That brings me to another plant, which is bells of Ireland, another flower where I realized you don't need a full 200 tray of bells. You only need half a tray. So I gave the other half to grower friend Jess. But you can see I actually already have some plugs in the ground. These arrived in late September, and I got all the plugs in within like 2.5 weeks, which I was pretty proud of. But I'm gonna let these overwinter. So I'm letting them do their thing in the sun, photosynthesizing a little bit. And then we are going to overlay these with a thin layer of crushed leaves, again, as a means of insulation protection. I also have some garlic that is intercropped here. So garlic is the only vegetable crop that I have been able to get into the ground so far this year. Over here, you can see we've got some stalk that still needs to get pulled out. I'm letting some of this go to seed so that it could self-seed. Here in between, we've got curcuma. Curcuma is a tropical type of flower that really, really wants the heat. So I would say like well before frost in late September, you started seeing the leaves yellow, and I do need to dig these up. I started digging these up, and to be honest, it was a little hard for me to be able to tell what was the bulb and what wasn't. So that's on my to-do list over the next couple of weeks. But you can see this is what curcuma looks like when it's dried up. This was a really great experimental crop. It's actually something I would grow a lot more of next year if I was going to focus completely on flowers, because I think that this type of crop does really well in our humidity in July, August. But I'll talk more about that later. Some more plugs that went in. I got 2 trays of 2 different colored delphinium. So here they are. They were all put into the ground. This was probably first week of October. So they've definitely started putting on a little growth. They've suffered from the lack of rain that we've had. We've had about, I would say, over a month of basically no rain. But yet these are still putting on a little bit of growth because I have been watering them sporadically. There was some food waste dug in underneath. So this is clay soil that has been amended with carbon matter, and that really helps in times like this when we don't have natural rainfall. So we've got basically 2 small rows of delphinium that hopefully we'll be able to use in the spring. Over here, we have some perennials that are coming in, and this is a bed of lilies that got munched down by the deer. I think they've already finished photosynthesizing, so it's totally fine. But this is Hypernicum. So these create these little berries, which kind of hard to see over here. I've actually harvested a couple of stems already, but I'm planning on using this as greenery for any additional flowers I may have. I'm actually getting my pre-chilled tulip bulbs in a couple of days. So we're going to attempt to get early December blooms, and we'll see if these will be green enough for me to use as greenery in those bouquets. This is the bells of Ireland that didn't get fully ripped out after the spring, so you can see how bushy it is. But this entire bed over here, you can see still has some leaves that did not fully decompose from last year. And the learning here was these were full-size leaves. So we want to make sure that we crush them so that way they have a chance to actually decompose and contribute back to soil. What you don't want to do is put on these full leaves that are big, that get matted down and basically suffocate the soil by not letting oxygen and water go in. You want to make sure that there's all these nooks and crannies and that you're basically encouraging the speeding up of the decomposition process. This over here is Daucus. I don't think it's going to bloom. It's also gotten nibbled down by the deer. The deer have done a lot of damage. We've been chasing around the deer and patching the fence where possible. Like, so you can see over here, there's some metal over here to reinforce it. But literally, it felt like there was a week where every single day we were coming out and there was a new hole. And at a certain point, I was like, well, there's really nothing left else to eat. But clearly I'm wrong because they've been eating some other stuff. Here's some more bells of Ireland over here. So you can see this is this part over here plus that patch over there is about 100 bells of Ireland. I've been cramming them a little bit closer together, and basically, like, I did that over the spring and it worked really well. I find that they can support themselves a little bit better when you cram them closer together, and you can kind of get away without netting. So that's the same approach I'm taking for next spring. This here is my experimental fall ranunculus. Now, I hadn't put these in during the time that I wanted to, which was early August. These went in basically late August, and I really did wish that I had the extra few weeks because they look so good, and I think that they would have been ready to send up shoots and blooms if they were in a few weeks earlier. But again, we were really preoccupied with my daughter's treatment, so obviously that took precedence. But at this point, these would actually be really great candidates for overwintering if it weren't for the fact that this is also a really great place for me to grow no-dig tulips. So what I do is I just put tulip bulbs in here and I put a thin layer of soil with a lot of leaves, and it allows me to pull out the tulips really, really easily since it's a raised bed. So we'll see, maybe I'll just do half or like a center of tulips over here and let the ranunculus overwinter and see what happens. But this is the only bed that I actually did ranunculus in. I've got another bed over there that has some ageratum that needs to be pulled out. We've got a lot of sea holly here. This is what sea holly looks like at the end of the season when it's basically done. It still sent up quite a few shoots during the fall, so I was able to use these in bouquets, which was awesome. But for the most part, this is done. These are all of my lilies that have been chowed down by the deer. You can see literally every single leaf was chowed away. I think a family of deer came in about a month ago and just saw the party buffet that they had. So all of these lilies were actually double rose lilies that were supposed to bloom in the fall, so I didn't get them. And you can see they did the same thing over here. So what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna leave them here. I'm gonna see if they will overwinter. They actually missed a couple of lilies. So this crate over here tells me if anything has gotten in because they love lilies. So you can see that there are already some mini buds here. It's too late for these to bloom. If I bring them inside and put them under lights, they will bloom, but I'm not gonna do it for like 8 stems. Now, what has been really interesting is seeing how the callas have fared in frost. So you can see that some of them have definitely been impacted by the frost, the browning, but there are still many that are perfectly fine. And I found that interesting because callas are supposed to be less tolerable of the cold versus something like a lily. And I find that lilies at this point, as long as they don't have buds that are about to blow open and color up, they're actually fine in this type of weather. So again, we've gotten down to 34 degrees was our coolest, and you can see that these lilies are perfectly fine, and even these callas still seem to be doing pretty well. So that was the good thing about not having the time to do anything in the field, was I got to observe how things perform in extreme weather conditions when on paper they're not supposed to survive. So again, this was a double lily that got chowed down. So something definitely came in here over the past week and probably missed that crate. And yeah, so you can see that we've still got a little bit of cleanup. I've got some stock left. This stock is actually looking pretty good over here. So perfectly tolerating the cool conditions. The stock is really, really stretching up during this time of year because it's just so cool at night. So that's also just like good data for me to have. So eventually all of that stuff over there will come out over here. I need to clean up this little yarrow patch over here. But for the most part, you can see a lot of what needs to get done has been done. Oh, and this is feverfew over here, which I really didn't get much out of this year because it had thrips in the spring, but I did get a couple of stems in the fall. Like you can see that there are still some viable stems right now if I wanted to make bouquets. So I've been able to get patches of yarrow and feverfew here and there. So it's nice to have that as an option in case if you need it. Like look at this feverfew. It looks really, really good. And then you can see that there's also some yarrow over here that you could use. So I'm probably going to make a couple of small bouquets, courtesy bouquets for some of my best customers to pick up this weekend. And yeah, this is basically it for the flower field. Now that I've talked about what we did and what we're going to do to put the field to rest, I want to talk a little bit about next year. Now you've already seen some plugs in the ground, so I'm definitely going to be growing flowers. I have ranunculus corms, anemone corms, tulips, daffodils that still need to go in the ground. Now the question becomes, how much do I actually grow? Because next year, I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to scale back on the amount of flowers that I grow and instead scale up on the amount of food that I grow. So specifically, I want to grow foods that are hard to find organic versions of, but also just hard to find. So we're talking about cultural foods that, you know, your local grocery store is just not going to carry because there's not enough demand. And the reason why I want to do this is because I had mentioned earlier that I've been spending a significant amount of time on nutrition for my daughter. My daughter had a G-tube, which is a feeding tube placed in her stomach. It's this little tube that you can connect a like little hose to essentially, and you can pump food in there. Now, most people pump commercially blended formulas. We opted to blend our own food and put it into the tube. I'm told that this is not very common. We're actually the first oncology family at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia to do so, which was kind of shocking to me because we only learned about this blenderized tube feeding diet through the manual that came with the pump and the feeding tube. So it's not like we went out on a limb and found this. This came in the manual. But anyway, so we're the first family to do it. And what that means is that I spend a lot of time, probably like every other day to every 3 days, blending food for my daughter and putting it into her tube. And the types of food that go in there are very nutrient dense foods like cruciferous vegetables, organ meats, and just stuff that like she normally wouldn't eat or even an adult wouldn't eat. So we joke that she probably eats healthier than all of us through that tube feeding. And the reason why this is relevant is because as I've started doing this, I've started going to a grocery store, trying to find organic versions of things. Some things are easier to find and some things aren't. So I want to grow those things that aren't easy to find organically, and I want to grow things that should be incorporated into all of our diets, but we just don't because it's not something that is easy for us to find. So the content may start shifting, honestly, to a mix of both vegetables, fruit-bearing fruits, as well as flowers. So there's going to be a lot more intercropping, I think, next season. All right, so the implications of all that, I think there's two implications. One is I'm not sure if I'm going to be selling wholesale, and I don't think that's a decision I need to make for at least a few more months. So we'll see how my daughter's treatment goes and whether or not that's just something that I want to spend my time on. So in a future video, we'll actually break down my sales. Wholesale is a significant part of my total flower sales, but I've also been building that local country store presence and just got a pretty decent fat check. So I feel like that sales channel is actually going pretty well, and we'll cover that in a separate video. But the second implication is that I'm probably going to start a lot more from seed because now I don't need trays of one variety in a single color. And I think that as my priority shifts to making sure that the seed that I start for vegetables is successful, I'm also going to see more successful outcomes with the seeds that I start for flowers, because in the past I could not be trusted to start anything that needed more than like 2 or 3 weeks in a soil block. So things like zinnias work for me because they don't need a lot of time in the soil blocks, but things like snapdragons, lisianthus don't work as well for me because I'm not very good at babysitting, especially if I'm prioritizing other things like winter tulips when those seeds are being started. So speaking of winter tulips, let me show you what I have in the pole barn. I'm still undecided on how many winter tulips I'm going to do this year. I definitely will be doing some. I'm just not sure how many. And again, I think that the results of next week's operation is going to be a big factor in what I end up deciding. Welcome to the pole barn, which is a mess right now, but we've been using this as a fulfillment station over the last 2 months. So thank you to everyone who bought corms from us, because we're really nearly out of all of our ranunculus corms. We've got some bags left, nearly out of anemones, but now we're on to bulb season. So you can see there's some muscari bulbs in there. There's some tulip bulbs in here. These are all non-chilled tulip bulbs. So we still have some inventory left. They look really, really good. So let me show you, like, this is what this one looks like over here. This is Katinka, which is actually a sub. I think many of you guys know that it was a challenging bulb year for Holland. So we're really glad that we got the majority of what we wanted. There's daffodil bulbs. Some of the varieties are sold out, but some aren't. I mean, you can see like how good these daffodil bulbs look. They're really big. And let me tell you, my suppliers are awesome. I'm going to give them a shout out. This is from Ampersand Bulb Company. So formerly Little Farmhouse Flowers, who split out their bulb division and flower division. Great option for tulips, daffodils, lilies. Like, they've really expanded into a lot of bulbs. What I like about them is that they're sourcing varieties that you may not find elsewhere and just giving us another option. You've also got Netherland Bulb Company, which I typically use for my non-chilled bulbs. So you do need a wholesale license to buy from all of these companies that I'm going to be mentioning. But if you can afford wholesale quantities, I definitely encourage you to go through that route versus buying 100 or 50 here and there, and even from me, right? Because I'm technically reselling, and so I have to resell at a higher price point in order for me to make some money and cover my costs. There's also Ownings over here where I don't get tulip bulbs from them, but they are a great source for tulip bulbs. I get a lot of my lily bulbs from them, but the anemones as well as some of the ranunculus corms came from there. So those are my top 3 suppliers that I would definitely recommend you guys looking into if you want to buy wholesale. So as you can see, we've got some varieties that we're still waiting on, but what we do is we package orders to make sure that we've held the inventory for those orders. And once the last variety comes, then we are able to ship out the entire order. But at this point, I think we have about only 30 orders left to ship. And most of them are orders with the chilled tulip bulbs, which actually I think begin shipping soon next week. So it shouldn't be that much more time before we start shipping out those bulbs. I will be getting a lot of these daffodil bulbs into the ground. These here are actually paper whites. So people force these for Christmas. I've never forced them, but I was shocked at how giant these are. So similar to hydroponics or anything else that you put into water, you put some stones in a vase, you put these on top, and these should actually force for you. So these are in our options for daffodils. We sell daffodils by the hundreds. And so you can actually select these paper whites as a part of that if you like. But what I like about daffodils is obviously they perennialize. They're a little bit more expensive than a tulip bulb, but honestly not by that much. And I do think that they carry their weight a little bit better than tulips because they perennialize and they should give you blooms year after year. So we still got a few varieties left. Like this one is Tahiti, which I bought on recommendation of my friend Jordan. She had great success with these. These are really, really tall daffodils. We've got some Ice King left. We are actually, this is Precocious and Obdam, which I believe we're going to be sold out. But yeah, we'll update the inventory. So if you want to go online, I'll put the link in the description below. And you can see if there's anything that you still need for your season. And we'll be shipping basically within like the next 2 weeks so that you guys can get them all into the ground. So as you can see, it's been a pretty busy last month and a half. I would say that I stopped selling flowers about 2 weeks ago, and for the month of October and a bit of, well, actually most of September, we were selling primarily through the country store. I went to the cooperative only twice this fall season. So I had prepared this field to be optimized for the fall for the cooperative, but we just didn't make it down there. So I was able to invite another flower farmer down here a couple of times to cut for her flower cart. So not all the flowers went to waste. I would say that the marigolds, the ageratums were definitely the stars of productivity in the late fall. I had done a video showing that before, and I still owe my Patreon supporters an article on that productivity. I have all the data, it just needs to get written out. But again, like those are flowers where when I scale back down, I don't need a full tray of even 100 marigold. I mean, I would say like the amount of output I got from those marigolds was insane. It was probably one of the most productive flowers I ever got. And we all, between me and that other flower farmer, probably cut about 20% of the ageratum. We had this conversation where I was like, you actually came in here and cut because it feels like you didn't make a dent. And that's how it felt throughout the entire fall season. So it was great to see all that beauty and color in there. Just wish it kind of got put a little bit more to use, but I felt like we maximized as much as we could. So with all that, I'm gonna give a quick update on E. And I think that future videos are either going to be focused on the business side, wrapping up my season, giving you guys a summary of what I learned, and then potentially some about winter tulips.